Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Brandon and I still make videos. Now, in as much as I make these videos, there's some terms that I oftentimes use that fly over a few people's heads. In this video, I'm going to explain some of the camera jargon. Let's get into it. So I'm gonna try my best to explain 10 terms in under 2 minutes. I'm gonna put a timer right now. First up is ISO. ISO determines how sensitive a camera sensor is to light. The lower the ISO number, the less sensitive the camera is. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it is. For instance, shooting at ISO 100 outdoors is great because you're limiting the sensitivity to light of the camera, whereas shooting at ISO 6400 in daylight might not work for you. Next up is aperture. This is the opening on the lens that allows the light to travel through from the other side onto the camera's sensor. The more wide open a lens at say f1.2, the more light is allowed onto the sensor. The more closed your aperture is at say f11, the less light you're allowing onto the sensor. So that's aperture. Moving right along to its cousin, depth of field, which is how much of the image is in focus. Portraits usually have a background that's out of focus. This is to separate the subject from the background and it's called shallow depth of field. Whereas when you're taking photos or videos of landscapes, you have a lot more in focus, thus a larger depth of field. Next up is shutter speed, which is how long an image is exposed to light after you hit the shutter release button. The longer an image is exposed to light, the more you're going to start seeing motion blur. Whereas the higher your shutter speed value, at say 1/500th, 1/600th going up, the less light you're allowing the image to get exposed to, which means a much more steady image that won't have any motion blur. When shooting video, shutter speed should always be double your frame rate. If you're shooting at 25 frames per second, then definitely your shutter speed needs to be double that, which is 50. If you're shooting a 50 frames per second video, then your shutter speed needs to be double that, which is 100. This is to produce the most natural looking image in terms of motion blur. Moving on to IBIS, which is in-body image stabilization. This means your camera's ability to smooth out your shots as you shoot handheld. Think of it as a cushion for your sensor. When you're moving around, it's going to help make your footage look a bit smoother, especially if you're shooting handheld. If your camera doesn't have this feature, then you get yourself an IBIS enabled lens, which will do more or less the same thing for you. Next up is frame rates or frames per second. This is how many frames your camera captures in 1 second when shooting video. The current standard for South African broadcast is 25 frames per second, whereas in other countries it goes up to 50 or even 60 frames. In essence, the more frames you're capturing per second, the more you're going to be able to slow it down when editing your footage for you to get the beautiful slow-mos. Next up is white balance, which is the process of removing unrealistic color tones in your camera while you're still shooting. For instance, the whites in your video need to remain white and not orange or blue. This can all be determined by the color temperature of the lighting in the room you're in. However, if you find it complicated to adjust white balance, your camera should have an auto white balance setting. Be very careful of this one though, because it can make things really blue and it can make things really warm depending on where you are and the quality of your camera's sensor. If you watched last week's vlog, then you should definitely remember this. This is called burst mode. It's when you take as many photos per second as your camera allows. When you're holding down the shutter release button, your camera will go bananas and take as much as it can. This feature is really great when you're taking action photography where you need to freeze every moment. To freeze every moment, by the way, you still need your shutter speed to be all the way up so it captures all the motion as it happens. Next up is focal length, which is the angle of view that your lens provides you. The wider your focal length at say 8mm is the more wider your shot is going to be. Whereas the higher your focal length is at say 400mm, the more narrower your view is. So in simple terms, focal length is how wide or how narrow your lens is. Next up is megapixels, which literally means 1 million megapixels in a photo. An image is made up of many tiny little dots that are called pixels. The more pixels you have in an image, the more sharper the image can be and the more wide uses you can have for it. You can put it on a billboard and be billboard boys worldwide. However, megapixels don't count in video. The higher your megapixels in video, the more terrible your low light performance is going to be, which is why the Sony a7S II is a 12 megapixel camera and performs amazingly in low light conditions. Alright guys, I know this is well over 2 minutes, but I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on post notifications. Also, if you have any other questions, let's interact down below in the comment section. But for now, as we've been doing with all the episodes of season 2, I'm about to close it in a different South African language, and today it's, hold on, Swati, and it goes Sitohlangana evikini lelilandzelako, which means I'll catch you guys next week. Sure.